Hey y'all, I wanted to do a lesson here for PGH on the half-whole diminished scale. I've actually been kind of talking about doing this lesson for a while, and I keep sort of dragging my feet on it. I started working this scale extensively. I mean, I've kind of known about the scale for a long time, but I decided during the pandemic that I wanted to get it figured out once and for all, and here we are 2 years deep into this thing, and I still don't really feel like I have it mastered by any stretch, not even close, really. But in my process of working it, I have found a few things that I can sort of get my head around and that really do work pretty well. So I figured for that reason it's probably worth sharing my progress here. So let's see, the half-whole diminished scale. First of all, it's not to be confused with the diminished arpeggio, like a diminished seventh arpeggio, which is what you hear in, say, Slipknot. Or Stash has a big diminished arpeggio. That's a diminished seventh chord arpeggio. That is certainly present within this half-whole diminished scale. But, oh yeah, that's Willow back there showing you her belly. It's present in the scale, but there's a little more going on in the scale that's not happening in the arpeggio. So a little bit of a different thing. Just don't want to confuse those two things. Let's see. So the structure of it is right there in the name, half-whole. So if I were to start on a root, I picked the key of D, by the way, because I was jamming along recently to Stash during, or not Stash, I'm sorry, Free during Phish's New Year's show. Right? And there's this big jam on like a D7 sharp 9 chord, and that 7 sharp 9 chord, by the way, encompasses a lot of what's going on in the diminished scale, which I'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, if I were to do it just on the D string, starting with the open D, basically just go half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half, whole, half, whole. That gives me the scale. If I put that into a single position, there's a lot of different ways we can do it. But for me, the most useful one was when I started orienting it around just like the minor pentatonic in the key of D. For better or for worse, I tend to relate a lot of things to that minor pentatonic scale, I guess just because I grew up playing rock and roll, and probably the first 15 years that I played guitar was pretty much the only scale I knew, so it's definitely well drilled into my head. But if I just working with the upper octave of it, what I can do here, let's see, so I've got my root on the 12th fret there. I'm going to add the flatted 7th below the root, and that gives me a whole step right there, and then I'm going to have a half step above the root, which gives me the flat 2 or the flat 9, minor 3rd, major 3rd, flat 5, natural 5th, 6th, flat 7th. There's my root again, and I can also add flat 2, flat 3, natural 3 above that. Kind of try to keep coming back to that chord just so we can sort of hear those things together. So if I look at that scale, a couple things stand out to me. So first of all, it's actually not like that minor pentatonic scale, for example, is almost completely there in the half-whole diminished, right? Like I've got my root and my flat 7th, and then minor 3rd in the minor pentatonic. The 4th right here, in this case it's a G, that's the one note of this scale that's not present in the half-whole diminished. That flat 5, though, that's right there if you apply if you add that flat 5 and you get the blues scale. So that note is in the diminished as well. Your 5th is there, your flatted 7th. So most of that scale is also right there in the diminished scale. And so what I started to realize when I added these things up is like, okay, this scale is actually not that far removed from stuff that I already know and I'm super familiar with. It's also, if you look at a dominant 7th chord arpeggio, again, working in D here, there's my D root, there's my flatted 7th, 3rd, natural 3rd, major 3rd, 5th, flat 7th, root, 3rd. all of that is right there in the scale as well. And in fact, another thing that happens a lot in the blues is, right, you maybe approach that major third from a half step below from the minor third. So that minor third to major third, and then I'm going back to the root there, that is a super characteristic sound of the blues. It's all over the place. And by the way, that D7 sharp 9 chord has both of them, right? It's got the F, which is the minor third, and then it's got the F sharp here, which is the major third, both right there in the chord. That's part of what gives it such a nice little crunch, right? So that's kind of what I mean when I say that this chord encompasses a lot of what happens in the diminished scale, because you've got both thirds present. Let's see. Okay, so, and then, all right, so with that diminished scale, or with that, with that dominant seventh arpeggio, also, if we add, with the exception of the root, if we add a half step below each one of the other notes of that dominant seventh arpeggio, the third, the fifth, and the seventh, so flat third, flat five, and then, the seventh is already flatted, so we add the sixth, the half step below that. So then we get root, flat, minor third to major third, flat five to natural five, and then six to flat seventh. That's, again there, that's all really common stuff in the blues, right? Approaching your chord tones from a half step below. The one oddball that little example didn't cover was this flat nine, which is also there. It's a little harder to handle that note in my opinion, so I kind of skip it occasionally, and the rest of the scale works great, so that's one thing you can do right off the bat, is just leave that flat nine out of the scale, and the rest of the scale is actually pretty easy to work with. Anyway, let's see. One thing I'll also point out, I kind of forgot to mention, is that if I just play the scale, in my opinion, that doesn't sound that great. And I think that was one of my big stumbling blocks in learning how to use that scale, is I was just practicing the scale, and it just doesn't sound that great on its own by itself, like devoid of the context of chord tones and all of that. When I start looking at the scale as it relates to the chord tones, that's when it starts to make some more sense. All right, so anyway, the diminished scale is a symmetrical scale. It's a little tough to explain in full detail what that means, but what it amounts to on the fretboard is that anything you do in that scale can then be repeated in minor thirds on the fretboard, so every 3 frets. So D half whole diminished. I'm going to start my free loop here so you can hear this. Half whole diminished off of D. I can move up to F and play half whole diminished off of F, and it's effectively the same scale. Oops. As I do it, and this is kind of an important point, is I'm trying to resolve my ideas back to chord tones of the D or D7. So that was F half whole diminished. I could move up to A flat, or I'll drop an octave here and do A flat half whole. Or I could do it off of B. Oops. And that brings up one thing right away, is like, even though I can move my patterns around every 3 frets, it doesn't necessarily mean I can do the exact same lick in 4 different places on a fretboard, because as you move that lick around, your relationship to the chord tones of that home chord of D is going to change. So you kind of have to be paying attention to that, and that's where the practice comes in, right? Is working with the scale and kind of listening to how each of your notes wants to resolve. But let's see. So, but that parallel structure is something that I can really take advantage of with when I'm coming up with licks. out of this scale. So, for example, a real common blues lick that I might do in D would be starting on the 7th, 6th, 5th, flatted 3rd to major 3rd. Well, anything that I do in that diminished scale, like that whole lick is present there in that scale, and so anything I do in that diminished scale, I'll start my loop back up here, I can repeat off of every 3 frets, right? So I could do it in F. Now, again, chord tones are different here in my relationship, and it happens that when I do that lick, I'm landing on an A, which is indeed part of the D chord as well, right? Let's see what happens when I do it off of A flat. Works pretty well, and again here I landed on the C, so I'm on the flat at 7. B is going to get a little funky actually, because I landed on the E flat, or D sharp, which is the flat 9, right? So I'm not on a chord tone there, so I might need to go pretty cool there. So anyway, that can be a source for some licks, right? I could go, oops. So doing, basically the same lick, but then moving it in minor thirds. The only thing you got to kind of watch out for in that situation is just sounding predictable. At this point, I'm just trying to get my head around the scale. I'm not really too worried about being predictable. I just want to come up with licks that sound good, But anyway, so if you look at that scale and really spend some time with it, you find some structures that can be pretty interesting. Like one that I stumbled across was also very similar to the minor pentatonic, but it's just this little box of minor thirds. So I'm just going 10, 13. I'm only doing it on 4 strings here, starting on the D string, right? So all of that is in the scale. I'm not even necessarily thinking about chord tones there so much. I'm going to be resolving the chord tones, but when I'm playing this, I'm just... So I can play that lick, so I just went up and down that pattern. But then I just resolved at the end back home to that D. Well, and I can do that every 3 frets, right? I could do it off of F here. Or off of B. That one sounds a little funny, but so if it sounds funny, you don't do that one, right? Or I could do it off of A flat. And so again, here I can play with that parallel structure like that's just kind of randomly playing through that pattern, which isn't inherently going to sound very musical. But it's just sort of an example of how you can come up with some ideas out of this scale, as you can just kind of play around with those parallel structures, and then just, always paying attention when you do it to how it relates to that home chord that you're playing over. Let's see. So I did this in the context of free, but there's actually a lot of Phish jams, where Trey treats at least a chunk of the jam like pretty much, just blues rock. Like I'm picturing, let's see, I even kind of made a little list here, right? The Moment Dance Jam that's in C, Chalk Dust Torture in E, 46 Days in B. Like these are jams that Twist is another one. These are jams that are, basically like a dominant 7th chord kind of sound, and Trey just tends to rip a lot of blues licks over them, whereas again, playing off of that like minor third to major third thing, mixing up the sounds of, say, the Mixolydian mode and adding some minor pentatonic in there, which again, those two things together give you that minor third to major third relationship, which is super characteristic of the blues. So there's actually a lot of places where you could make some use of this half-whole diminished scale. Now, in jazz, that scale is more used resolving to another chord. That's kind of beyond the scope of what I want to talk about in this video, and honestly, it's something that I haven't gotten super well mastered, although I'm starting to get my head around it too. But basically, that relationship of the 5 chord to the 1 chord. So, for example, I think we were talking about Possum in another thread, right? So that's a blues in E. And your first chord change, you're going from an E7 to an A7. So in jazz, it would be really common to take the E half-whole diminished scale and use it as sort of a tension scale to resolve back to the A7, or to resolve to the A7, which is the 4 chord. E7 to A7 is like, it's the same as the 5 to the 1 to 4. It's the same relationship as 5 to 1. So once you've started to play around with the scale a little bit more and kind of get the sound in your head and get it under your fingers, that's probably the next thing I would recommend working on, is how can I resolve that scale up a fourth, like happens in a 12-bar blues. So anyway, that's my few thoughts on the half-whole diminished. Happy to answer any questions anytime if you guys have them. Thanks a lot.